Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here from St. Paul University, and I'm now in part 7 of my series of lectures on H.A. Prichard's 1912 essay, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? So as I said, this is part 7, so there's a few things I'm going to be presupposing here, so if you're not familiar with Prichard's work or my previous videos, go back and check those out and have a look, of course. There's no real substitute for digging into the essay itself. These lectures are just to help clarify some points. Now, we've seen that Prichard, in his long discussion of the history, he comes to separate, it makes a distinction within the concept of motivation. That is, think of motivation as a genus with a couple of different species. One species is desire, and one species is a sense of obligation. So what gets us going to do stuff are desires and sometimes a sense of obligation. Now, he asks, is this really defensible? Because you could say, well, maybe there's really no such thing as a sense of obligation, and ultimately senses of obligation are just really desires. Now, Prichard admittedly doesn't really offer much of an argument to defend his distinction, but there's two things going on here. One is he tries to draw an analogy with a certain situation that we often experience. I'll look at that in a second. And the second thing is he thinks the distinction does some explanatory work. So I'll look at that in a second. So there's two things to it. First thing, as I said, there's an analogy. Well, is it defensible? He says, yes, let's consider the experience of revenge. Now, we've all had situations where, you feel you were wronged or whatever, and you want to take up some action to get back at someone or an organization or whatever. Okay, so we've all experienced revenge. Now, Prichard is saying that not only have we experienced things like revenge, but even within this experience of revenge, there can often be two sides of it, two different sort of mini experiences that add up to this experience of wanting to take revenge. So we're unpacking this notion of the wanting to take revenge. So in this sense, we have something fairly simple and admittedly fairly sketchy and schematic. So X desires revenge against Y. Even though X is desiring this revenge, it's still possible that X recognizes that he or she or they ought not to take revenge. So we can be conflicted. You can feel like you want to take revenge and I really want to, I really desire revenge. And yet at the same time, you can recognize something quite different, that you ought not to do it. Right? And it's not that you ought not to do it for pragmatic reasons, or you just think, no, it's actually wrong. This is wrong. So you can have a sense of obligation conflicting with your desire, a sense of obligation that you ought not to take revenge, conflicting with your desire to take revenge. So here we have basically a clash. So what he's pointing out is that within within the motivations, we have a clash between a desire and a sense of obligation. But that's not the whole story, because sometimes the sense of obligation and the desire, they can dovetail, or they're parallel, whatever term you like. So you could have, let's say if someone does a nice thing, like a favor, you can have an obligation, a sense of an obligation to return a favor, pay back in kind. Someone does something nice and you have this feeling of that you should act in a way that you return the favor. Now that's important, the notion of acting, feeling an obligation to act. Keep that in mind, because that's going to be important for Prichard in a little bit here. But back to the issue at hand. So you have an obligation, a sense of an obligation to return the favor, and a desire to do so. So as I said, these dovetail. So is this a great argument? Well, it's basically just drawing an analogy, and it's just articulating possible conditions and asking you, does this work with your experience? So it's not really necessarily, shall we say, an analytic argument. It's more of what we might want to call a phenomenological argument, is making an appeal to experience and saying, is your experience like this? And if you say yes, that's about as far as this really goes. It still could be the case that this doesn't go through. Now, let's put that to the side. One of the other things that Prichard says that this breaking up or seeing motivation as a genus with the two species, sense of obligation and desire, is that it does some explanatory work for us. And there's two things that it helps us to explain. One's going to be about this split between moral philosophy or the dryness and things of literature like Shakespeare, and the second one is going to have to deal with Aristotle. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at it. So this benefit of this split of motivation, right? Basically what I talked about here, this split of motivation into desire and a sense of obligation. This corresponds to a distinction. It's not identical, but it corresponds to discussions of virtue and through desire. So desire is connected up to discussions of virtue. And the sense of obligation is connected to discussions of moral philosophy. So if we think of this split of motivation into these two species, corresponding to discussions of this split corresponds to the split between discussions of virtue and discussions of moral philosophy, we can explain what Prichard says is a basic fact. And what's that? The fact that moral philosophy, when we look at books on moral philosophy, like the stuff Prichard's writing, they tend to be dull and distant. What do I mean by that? Or what is Prichard after? They're removed from life. Dull and distant from life. They don't seem to really, latch on to the things that are important. So what Prichard is saying, you may often in your everyday experience not really think much about obligations or anything like that, and you're just really dealing with your experiences of desires. Hence, moral philosophy books all about all obligations are just going to strike you as very dull and quite distant. Now, and the fact is that moral philosophy is like that, and then you turn to stuff like Shakespeare, where it's all about, really, Prichard would say it's more about virtue, because it's all about passions and desires and people doing right and wrong things, but it's always about the issues about morality, and in this sense, morality is virtue. So Shakespeare takes on sort of the juicy stuff of ethics, whereas moral philosophy has this more kind of a dry side. But Prichard says, let's admit that the best, as he says, the best man, or as we would say, the best person, is really someone that acts from both the passions and the sense of obligation, that the two are dovetailing, as in this case, where you have the sense of an obligation to return the favor, and you have a desire to do so. So everything is fitting together. And as Prichard, as he would put it, that's when virtue and moral philosophy are really coming nicely together. But he wants us to think of them as separate. And because we think of them as separate, when you talk about one to the exclusion of the other, it can sometimes seem unsatisfying. And speaking of unsatisfying, this split of motivation also helps explain why Aristotle's virtue ethics is somewhat unsatisfying. So moral philosophy can seem a little dull and removed. Shakespeare, of course, is exciting and all jazzed up in a fictional form, but Aristotle, who concentrates on virtue, can be somewhat unsatisfying. So let's dig a little bit more into why Aristotle's virtue ethics, according to Prichard, could be somewhat unsatisfying. I left off just on the whole idea of what's the benefits of this split, and I mentioned why Aristotle, according to Prichard, might seem in his virtue discussions a little bit unsatisfying. Well, let's look a little bit more into this. For Prichard, an important thing is that when we're talking about grasping obligation, there's a key thing that he wants to stress here, and that is what you're really doing is you're grasping or sensing or feeling an obligation to act. That's what you're getting. Grasping obligation for Prichard is the obligation to act. Now you might think, well, okay, so what's so important about that? Well, so let's say I just wanted to answer why it's important. Let's look at a bit of a concrete situation. So if you grasp the obligation, so obligation to pay your bills. Okay? When you grasp the obligation to pay your bills, that's all you're grasping, is an obligation to do something. So it's an obligation to act, and that's it. So it's an obligation to pay my bills. It does not include this. Doesn't include anything else. And what else might it include? In other words, it can't include, according to Prichard, he just cuts this off, it doesn't include anything else like paying your bills in a cheerful manner, right? You cannot have a feeling or a sense of an obligation to act according to a certain motivation. So it's just an obligation to act, right? Not this, obligation to act. Let's all frame it as one thing. Not obligation to act out of a sense or of any kind of desire, right? So in other words, when we're grasping an obligation to act, it's just to act, just to simply do a particular thing, like pay a bill. Not to pay my bill and be happy about doing it. So you cannot have an obligation, feel an obligation to be virtuous, because remember, virtue has the notion of the passion rolled in to the doing of the action in the right way. So in this sense, Prichard says that all we can feel is an obligation to do the right thing. That's it. That's as far as the feeling of the obligation. But you can't feel an obligation to do the right thing and be happy about doing it, or do the right thing as a feeling of pleasure, right? So those things he excludes. And that's a bit unusual for a moral philosopher to talk like this, but Prichard wants to, draw the line very strictly on what obligation and how it links. So to action, and it just links to the bare action itself, no motivation around it, because it's just a simple obligation to act. All right, so now we can't feel the obligation to act from a particular desire, and so we can't really say we ought to be virtuous, because remember, being virtuous has deniers, has the desires built into it. So there's no real sense of feeling an obligation to be virtuous. Now, you might claim that you have an obligation to be virtuous or whatever, but Prichard said we can't feel that, because all we have is a feeling of an obligation to act, and act in specific circumstances, like to pay bills, but not a feeling of an action to be virtuous, right? So he wants to rule that out. And so in this sense, being virtuous, if this all goes through, then the splitting of motivations into the sense of obligation and acting on the basis of a desire, it's going to show why Aristotle's theory, it's not a theory, but Aristotle's understanding and his discussion of virtue is somewhat unsatisfying, because Aristotle really won't answer questions like, what ought we to do? He doesn't have obligations built in, right? Everything is good things to do and how you should go about doing them, namely with your passions in line. But if you want to strictly talk about obligations, Prichard says, Aristotle's not going to be that satisfactory, because he doesn't really talk about them. So now this brings us basically to the end of most of what Prichard is saying in this 1912 article. So we've basically got an overview of where things have gone wrong, and moral philosophy really is a very narrow study of obligation, and obligations are simply grasped immediately. They're not the process of thought or the conclusions of arguments. And so what Prichard is going to do, and I'm going to return to this in another video, of trying to give us a better idea of what moral philosophy is really going to look like when the only thing that we're talking about is just this pure notion of obligation to act. So stay tuned.